what is the one most irrefutable piece of evidence that Atlantis did exist?
I love this. So a lot of people aren't aware that the legend of Atlantis originates from the Egyptians. And it was, so Plato made it famous, but it was actually his distant relative Solon who had visited Atlantis 2,600 years ago. And what's so interesting is that he had said that the Egyptian priest had said that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years earlier. And when you add 2,600 plus 9,000, that's 11,600 years ago, which coincides precisely with the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe of 11,600 years ago, where there was a massive shift in temperature on Earth, a rapid end to the last ice age. And I'm like, what an insane coincidence to be so specific to say 9,000 years. It'd be one thing to say, oh, this was 10,000 years ago. But 9,000 years, 2,600 years ago coincides precisely with we know scientifically of this Younger Dryas climate catastrophe. What caused it? That's the debatable part. Whether it was an impact, a pole shift, sun cycles, whatever it was, that's the debatable part. However, there was, mass die-offs of various animals at that time, rapid rise of sea levels. And so I would say that more than anything, in my mind, goes beyond a coincidence. And then you have the site called the Richat structure, which just so happens to match such specific characteristics. Like when it says, made up of concentric circles, specifically 3 of water and 2 of land.
And who said that?
So here, it comes from Plato.
Okay.
The legend was passed down from his uncle of 6 generations apart, who had written about it, made its way to Plato, and then he communicated it in his, the Critias and the Timaeus. So, he didn't know Solon. He had died, 100, 200 years earlier.
Right.
So this is where people will debate. I'm like, well, how reliable is this?
Right. It's like the Bible, right? It's like the people who wrote the Bible, the canon, right, is written. It's shit that wouldn't hold up in court, essentially, right? It's people writing about things that happened with no witness testimony, and shit that happened hundreds, if not thousands of years prior.
Right.
And then also got rewritten and copied by people throughout the millennia. Right. So it's like a game of telephone.
Well, that's one of the reasons that myself, to answer your question about the evidence for Atlantis, I mean, I would take it, Atlantis is a term that I kind of use as an umbrella term. I think a lot of people do, but I think it's one of the important things to note out the gate. You're looking at, for a lost civilization, that's possibly one of them, the Richat structure. That's quite possibly where they got the idea of Atlantis from. But that idea could have come from multiple different things. And in addition to it, like you read Plato's account of it, you imagine if there was a lost civilization from 10,000 years ago. And so you go back a few thousand years and 7,000 years has passed or whatever, and people are writing about it, they're going to inject their culture into it. And so you read Critias and Timaeus, and you see that they happened to use the same metals on the wall that the Greeks used on their temples too. Who would have guessed, right?
Wait, what? About Timaeus and Critias?
Orichalcum, or what's it called?
Orichalcum. It's the Atlanteans. Their temples had the same precious metal that the Greeks liked to use.
This is according to Plato?
Yeah, allegedly.
Okay.
And they had, they had a democracy, and they had all this. This is stuff that was very Greek, right?
Yes.
And of course it was, because it's a fucking Greek story, man, right? Yeah. So I think that's one of the things to look for, or to pay attention for, is when we look at different cultures, we might find the same story in Japan, and it's going to be way different. It's not going to have democracy. It's not going to have orichalcum. It's going to have fishing, and it's going to have more focus on the sea. So, to answer your question, back to it, there's a few things that are like the shared gods you mentioned earlier, the master of animals. You've probably seen that one before. Like there's pictures of a woman with either a tiger on both sides of the snakes. Okay.
I've seen that.
Very common. The navel holding statues. This seems to show up.
Yeah, like the Moai has and the Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah, and you see these in South America, and it also seems to quite frequently correlate with the origins of low-level metallurgy. The things like the stone clamps, the metal clamps that are used, the fact that those hop the ocean. Like the nubs are one thing, but the clamps, to me, like if you go to a house and the studs in a wall are on 16-inch centers, right?
Yep.
That's okay. This is a fucking machine. This is how you build a house. When I wired a house, the staples go every 18 inches from a bend,
right,
and every 4 feet. So when you look at certain sites and you see like at Pumapunku at the top of each H block, they stick a little clamp. It's like, well, this doesn't look like they.
What are the? I'm not familiar with what the clamps are you're talking about.
The metal clamps that are poured. They'll take a seam of stone. And they'll have like an eye-shaped deal on either side.
Okay. I see what you're saying.
They pour metal into this indentation. We see them a lot in Egypt. They're bow tie shaped in Egypt a lot. The ones in South America are more eye-shaped. But the fact that in Pumapunku, for example, we know that they were used a lot in the old world. They show up in the new world a little bit in Bolivia. And at Pumapunku, they're used on these H blocks on each one. And it looks like a guy, standard operating procedure is what it looks like to me. It doesn't look like somebody's over there experimenting. These two stones might wobble apart. It looks like he's dealt with this problem before and knew exactly what to do to solve it. And it was the way they built things. So things like that to me seem to... if you look up, could you type in clamp with that?
You could even type in Egyptian clamp. I bet Ben Van Kerkwijk has a bunch of photos.
Yeah, you see right there. Like that.
Wow.
Okay. And so you see what look at that one, that second one down there. Like you see.
Holy shit.
Okay. Now these show up all across the world.
How have I never seen this?
This is one of my favorite. To me, again, I focus on a lot more of the mundane stuff because that's where I really end up being more fascinated. And to me, this is like kind of a smoking gun. We see it all over the world, and it's like a nail. A nail's going to look the same in a lot of different places, right? Whatever you innovate it. But this specifically using metal or wood, and specifically used in a manner that it's like, okay, do they fucking need them there? Are those stones still together 1,000 years later? But they didn't fucking need no clamps there, but they put them there. Why? Because that's what they did when they put stones together. And so this wasn't their first time doing it. I don't think that was their first rodeo. And we don't have any sites in Bolivia that really shows innovation. It just kind of pops up in a couple places and goes away. So to me, that's another smoking gun for this lost civilization that a lot of people would call Atlantis. A lot of other names might get ascribed to it. And again, a lot of the details, in my opinion, are definitely going to be lost to history. There's no question. But things like the Richat are very interesting, where it does bring details that there's really, I don't see how the Greeks could have gleaned basically any of that of traveling to that spot. Even in ancient Greece, that was a Sahara Desert, right? So
and it is interesting to mention that the Egyptians, so in that same tale, they said that the Egyptians were colonists of a civilization that was destroyed in a flood cataclysm. In that same tale, it's been taught and told on hundreds of cultures across 5 continents around the world. I'm like, there's something to it. It doesn't have to mean that the Peruvian Andes and the Himalayas were covered in water, but when the fact that there was a 400-foot rise sea level at the end of the last ice age, which happened, how fast it happened is so debatable. But
really?
Well, some people say it was over thousands of years, and some people will say that it was over a relatively short period of time where there would have been increments of flooding that could have been 100 feet in a day. I've heard different people say different things. Truth is, I don't know, but here's the fact that people should look at is that almost half the world's population today lives on or near a coastline, at least within 60 miles or 100 kilometers. Many have suggested that number or percentage would have been higher in ancient times because of more abundance of resources and easier to travel up the coastline. Right. But if there was a sudden rise in sea levels at a particular period of time, that would have been apocalyptic, so to speak, for so many people around the world on different continents, even if it was just a few, I don't know how many
it was
feet.
apocalyptic right here 3 months ago when that hurricane came.
Yeah.
There you go.
It was insane, man. Everyone lost their houses on the beach. It was like Mad Max right here.
And how high was that storm surge? How many feet?
It was like 9 feet.
Okay. So imagine if it was dozens of feet. It would have been, would anyone have been left to talk about it?
No. And in addition to that, this is one thing it's important to mention in the record. Look in the record and say, well, it took 1,000 years for the ocean to rise this much. Well, that 9 feet that you experience is 10,000 years from now is going to be a part of the record of the ocean rising so much over so many years. They're not going to see that 9-foot flood. It's going to be that doesn't show up in the permanent record as like when they look each year. What's the sea level? What's the sea level? They don't account for hurricanes. They don't account for those. But something like that happens and it reroutes rivers. I mean, I lived in Illinois near the Mississippi River in '94 when they had a major flood there, and it engulfed St. Charles, Missouri. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had to reroute the fucking river. No, they didn't have one 10,000 years ago, man. You see, the city gets swallowed forever, and then in the record, well, sea levels rose 2 inches a year. Well, they did, but right here at that time, completely wiped out overnight.
Yeah, my biggest skepticism when it comes to Atlantis is the Plato stuff, because the Greek experts, the Greek philologists that I've talked to, one of them being on this podcast, they say that when you're in school and you're learning about Socrates, for example, and a lot of the stuff that you learn about Socrates comes from Plato. They say that the teachers teach you that anything that you read Plato's Socrates was most likely bullshit. You have to take it with a grain of salt because Plato was a known liar. He wasn't.
They say that.
He wasn't a historian. He was a philosopher, and he came up with hypothetical thought experiments like the cave. And it seems plausible to me that, like in the Timaeus, that when they're talking about this war between Atlantis and Athens, is that it was some sort of hypothetical war game that they were trying to play out. And Atlantis was like a philosophical allegory, the same way Plato's cave was. Yep. And Plato, Aristotle obviously said a lot about Plato being a liar. And there's like Homer, like Plato was big into censorship. He wanted Homer to be censored. He wanted to restructure society in a better way that was based off of like the philosophers' ruling and all this stuff. So there's definitely, that's interesting to me.
Well, to speak on that real quick, yeah, he was a philosopher more than he was a historian for sure. But if you draw a parallel to the modern day, say you're trying to convince one of your friends that the West is falling, Western culture is disintegrating, say that's what your argument is, would you cite Harry Potter or would you cite Rome?
Rome.
Why? Because it's real. So if Plato was trying to make a point, wouldn't he cite a place that at least his contemporaries believed was real instead of just making some fucking land up? Oh, that one place, no, he would have, at least, in my opinion, he would have definitely taken something that people knew about, that people had believed in a lost civilization. They believed in Atlantis or whatever. Maybe they didn't have a name to it at the time. Yeah. But in my opinion, if he was using a metaphorical or an allegorical tool, there's no fucking way he would just conjure it out of thin air. It has way less teeth than citing something real.
It is worth mentioning that apparently only somewhere between 20 and 30% of Plato's work is actual allegory. So a lot of people say, well, he made things up, and it's like, well, most of his work wasn't. But what do I know? You know what I mean? Like that's
exactly. I can't read ancient Greek,
right? Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like
you have to take people's word for it.
Yeah, and so it's like it could all be all made up. The thing is that I just find that 9,000 year mark.
I believe there was an ancient. I think that there was a cataclysm. I think that there was. Especially when you look at things like the pyramids, that there was some sort of reset on humanity. I think that makes sense.
Yeah. And, when it comes to Atlantis, I have a friend, what she had said was, let me give her a shout out, Nikki Anna Jones. She had said that she looks at Atlantis not as a place, but as an epoch of time. The time of when people were traversing the continents, doing great things that was lost to time. That was Atlantis.
That's a great way of putting it, because that's like why you asked for the evidence, and I'm talking about things that span the ocean, because that's, to my mind, is exactly what it is. It's evidence of a civilization that's doing things that we wouldn't give them credit for.
It would be the missing chapter of human history, as Graham Hancock has put it. When it comes to the Richat, though, that is just such a fun mystery, and with the fact that it matches other striking similarities, like, for example, that the outer walls of Atlantis were said to be lined in gold. It turns out that Mauritania has enormous gold deposits that prior to the discovery of gold in North America, Europe got most of their gold from Mauritania.
Really?
That's the reason why they don't allow digging or ground penetrating radar out there. They're still protecting their gold. Also, other things like having an abundance of elephants. And now that we know that the Sahara was green up until approximately 5,000 years ago, And there's studies that show that there would have been a massive network of rivers throughout the Sahara, as well as the largest freshwater lake. And these studies have shown that it would have been massive routes for human migration all through the Sahara, which is now, of course, a big dust bowl. But I consider that more suggestive evidence that if there was a lost capital, why couldn't it be in the Sahara? And if the colonists went to Egypt on the other side of the continent, it's not that unreasonable to suggest. And I also say this, a lot of people say, well, it's not an island, so it couldn't be Atlantis. So I'm like, well, the part they leave out is that the ancient Greek word for island was Nessos and Nesson, which had 5 different meanings, one of which was island. The other was peninsula, promontory, as well as land within a continent surrounded by lakes, rivers, or streams. And one of the key details about this is that Atlantis was said to have a river that flowed from the mountains from the north. And so that Atlas Mountains, which is in modern-day Morocco, well, it turns out that the Tamanrasset River flowed at the same period of time of Atlantis up until approximately 5,000 years ago, and flowed either directly through the Richat or just north of it. And you can see this on maps. This is scientific studies that have nothing to do with Atlantis. But as far as water, you could argue that it came from the Tamanrasset River. So yeah, it's a fun topic. Like I can't, I've been clear on this in the past. Like I'm not 100% certain that Atlantis existed, or if it did, that it's the Richat. But to me, I'm like, there's so many striking similarities that it is, I still say it, by far the most likely location if there was one. However,
yes,
if there was to find evidence that this was the site, here's the part that's really fucked up. So for this theory to be true, it's dependent on a catastrophic flow of water that flowed over the Western Sahara. And if that was the site of Atlantis, people will say, well, where are the ruins? Well, unfortunately, that means it would have been blown out into the Atlantic Ocean off the western coast of the Sahara. And there's a fascinating study that talks about the Mauritanian seafloor slide that just off the coast, right in front of the Richat structure, extending like 150 miles north and south and a few hundred miles from east to west, is this layered sediment under the ocean. It's layered over 1.5 miles deep, like 3,000 meters or something like that. And I'm like, well, that's further suggestive evidence, not proof, suggestive evidence that if it was the site, that whatever that flow of water would have bulldozed that portion of the Sahara and caused all that layered sediment, what's now under the ocean. So if they were to go looking for relics of Atlantis, the gold would survive because gold doesn't rust. And it'd be a task for seafloor mining people that look for gold off the coast.
Wow.
But that could be a needle in a haystack. This may never be known. But if they were to find abundance of gold in that seafloor slide, I would say that would be, I don't want to use the word smoking gun, but that would be probably the only way to figure it out. I imagine.